We live in a time where masculinity is shamed and men don't know what it means to be a man. As a pastor and counselor, I've spent the better part of my life equipping and training others. My goal with this show is to translate my hard-earned experience into tools and tactics to help you become stronger as a man. This is the BraveCo podcast. I'm your host, Jason Vellet. Welcome back, men, to the BraveCo podcast. This week, I'm really excited for my guest. It's a guy named Jeremy Stalnecker. I have been following Jeremy for quite a while, just watching what he's doing with men and helping men grow stronger. And just his messages are really, really powerful. And I always tell you that I try to bring guys on that, like, when I look at them, I go, man, I want my life to be like them. I want the grit, the resiliency, and Jeremy's one of those guys. So if you follow him, or if you go follow him on his Instagram page, like, you'll just see all kinds of cool content, but, which we'll talk about in a minute, but he just finished 22 marathons in a row, which we won't dive in starting to talk about that. But again, like, Jeremy's just such an incredible man. And you're going to hear about his life story and what he's up to right now. But Jeremy's the CEO of a company called the Mighty Oaks Foundation, which really focuses on helping veterans heal from an unseen wound, which is a lot of people don't think about the wounds that you can't see in war, that come from war. And maybe we can argue that's probably the greatest wounding that happens is stuff that you can't actually see. But Jeremy really focuses, and his ministry focuses on helping those men get well. And so, man, I just have so much respect, Jeremy, for what you're doing. And I really can't wait to actually dive in more and hear your story and then what you're doing for those men. At BraveCo, we just have such a massive heart to see men get completely healed and walk in health and wholeness. And so thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jason. I mentioned this to you, but I've been following you from a distance as well. So it's super cool to connect. And when I got a message from you, I'm like, man, I've been, like, I had on my list, like, for a long time, I need to reach out. And then you did. So thanks for doing it. This is cool.
Yeah, man, it's great. Well, hey, why don't you tell me a little bit about your life, like where you grew up and then how do you transition into the military, and just take me through a little bit of that story.
Yeah. So I was raised here in Southern California. My mom and dad actually started a church in a little town here in Southern California called Hemet, California. I don't know who's familiar with Hemet, but here in Riverside County, and grew up there and watched my mom and dad go through the process of doing that and all that was involved. You know, my mom worked a full-time job to support our family. My dad was working nights and during the day was working in the ministry to get that church going. And I grew up in that. And I remember, watching them do that. I was so proud of them, but absolutely did not feel called to ministry at all. And I remember talking to my dad and saying, hey, do you think it would be okay if I didn't go into ministry? I was 14 years old. And he said, son, you got to do whatever God wants you to do. Whatever that is, we'll support it. And I said, I think God wants me to enlist in the Marine Corps. He's like, there's no way God wants you to enlist in the Marine Corps. That's not God. But through a long series of events, and some of that was college and other things, my parents put in front of me, I ended up actually being commissioned into the Marine Corps out of college, and served with 1st Battalion, 5th Marines here in Southern California, Camp Pendleton. I always joke I did my best to get away from California my entire life, and God kept bringing me back. Served there. My last deployment was to Iraq. And after that, God did a work in my heart, my wife's heart, and then it's just crazy how God brings those pieces together. But the one thing I said I would never do, left the Marine Corps and started working at a local church here in San Diego County. So, it's been wild, but a very patriotic family. My dad did not serve in the military, but very patriotic and very much drilled home that idea that we need to serve in our community. We need to serve other people. So the military was kind of a natural natural, maybe next step for me. And it was something that I always wanted to do, something I pointed my entire life toward. And then on the other side of that, God, brought me right back to the ministry. So it's crazy how God directs.
That's wild, man. Yeah. What was your job in the military?
I was an infantry platoon commander. So I was in a rifle platoon. So for those that are familiar with the Marine Corps, a rifle platoon had 37 or 8 Marines in my platoon. I was a second lieutenant. And then when I went to Iraq, I was actually in a much larger platoon with the people have seen them if they aren't even familiar with them, but the hardback Humvees, the heavy machine guns on top, that was a platoon that I had. So I had 84 Marines going into Iraq. And man, it was a great time for me. It was, again, that was the thing I'd pointed my entire life toward. It's funny to say it, and people that haven't served don't understand it really, but you train and you train and you train and you prepare and you plan and you think. And, I was 14 when I made the decision to go into the Marine Corps. So deploying to Kuwait and then going into Iraq and doing that, man, that was like, playing Pop Warner football and then getting thrown into the Super Bowl. I mean, that was a big deal. And for me, that was kind of like the pinnacle of everything I had ever dreamed about.
What was it like when you got there? Like, because I mean, so much build up to that moment, right? You're 14 and all you want to do is fight and protect for your country. But then when you actually got on the battlefield, was it what you thought it would be?
It was so crazy. And as you can imagine, it was just very surreal. You spend years training and preparing and all of the things that go into that. And then we were part of the infantry battalion, or we were the infantry battalion that breached the berm from Kuwait going into Iraq. So the southern objective of the war was our battalion. First KIA of the war, Shane Childers was one of our lieutenants. So, kind of the first firefight of the battle, the first firefight of the war was with our battalion. So we rolled in the middle of the night, did the things that we had trained to do, but you have these things happening, right? Like the tracers are coming back your direction. And it's the weirdest thing in the world. In training, obviously that doesn't happen. So you got the tracers coming back your direction. You have, casualty stuff you're dealing with. You have real people trying to kill you and you're returning fire on them. So it's almost like everything you've ever been told in your entire life since you were little not to do, you are now doing it. And it's important that you do it well. So that was weird. And then, when Shane died, kind of processing through that and what does that mean? And then you have, other Marines hurt and killed. And so you're working through all of that. In a sense, it was what I expected, but you can't account for the emotion that's connected to that and how that affects you personally. And then, it was days on end without sleeping. And so that compounds that. It was just a very surreal, very, very strange thing. But ultimately, as Marines, we prepared, we planned, we trained and executed very well. And so that was something you're told will happen, and it certainly did. So that was crazy to be a part of as well, just to see how all of that training and all that planning plays out in a real life environment. So yeah, pretty crazy.
How did you, if you don't mind jumping into it a little bit, like how did you cope in real time with, I'm in this environment that I've thought about for a long time, but things are happening that you really can't account for, right? Like somebody could tell you ahead of time, hey, you're going to experience casualties. Hey, somebody is going to be shooting at you. Hey, you're going to be facing a whole bunch of danger. But it's all theory, right? In that moment, like what was your go-to or what were you processing in real time during the battle, having not slept for days? I'm really curious. You're one of the first guys that I've actually had on the podcast that's had, this much experience on the battlefield. And I am just really curious, like, what was that like for you?
I think that everyone processes it differently. And I think there were different moments where things were processed differently. When you're rolling through it, particularly, that first night of the war, there was so much happening. We were supposed to, it was supposed to be a daylight movement into the country. And so all of our connection points, all of our symbols, everything that we were looking for was all visual. We'll see this on a vehicle. We'll know to connect there. And then we ended up going in 12 hours early. So it was the middle of the night. So it was just absolute chaos, as you can imagine. So that's number one. So you're just trying to figure it out, right? And then you're leading people. And so you're trying to do everything you're supposed to do. And then kind of like over here, this stuff's happening, but it's not really, you're not really catching it. Like tracers are coming my direction. I remember, I always say that. I don't think people get it. Like that was a profound moment when those red tracers were coming back at us. Right. So that was weird, but you don't really stop long enough to like think about what that actually means. You're just like, wow, that's weird. And then things are exploding. And then you're moving through these objectives where enemy soldiers were, or you had engaged them. And now, they're dead. And all of, what you would see on a battlefield is there. And so you're seeing it, and it's like almost this weird, like almost out of body experience. So it's very strange. And then when you start to have your people hurt and lost, I've written about this and talked about this. But Shane Childers was the first KIA of the war in Iraq. And if you look that up, first guy who died there, he was a prior enlisted Marine who became an officer. He was in our battalion. So I knew him. I was at a blocking position when he was shot and killed. So just a crazy thing, right? So in life, if someone that dies, everything kind of stops and you deal with that. And there's a grieving process and a lot that goes into that. Certainly if someone's murdered, if someone's, killed violently, there's a whole process there. So I've talked about this, but Shane was killed. We did what we needed to do. And then, later on that day or the next morning, the battalion staff, so battalion's about 1,200 Marines, but the staff was just a handful of us, 15 or 20 of us. We were called to our battalion commander's vehicle where we were given the next order. So, okay, we did this. Now we're headed to this objective. And I remember standing there and in that meeting thinking, certainly he's going to stop and talk about Shane. I mean, Shane was one of our officers. We all knew him. He was just killed. Certainly, at the time, Colonel Padilla is going to talk about this. And I remember as he's giving us the order and he's saying, you need to do this, you need to do that. He kind of looked up and I think he saw it maybe in our faces, right? He stopped and he said, look, I know that we just lost Shane, Lieutenant Childers, but we have a job to do and there are a lot of people depending on us. We're going to mourn when we get back. There will be a time for that, but this is not that time. Wow. And so we need to stay engaged in what's in front of us. And I remember how I felt then. I've written about it. I've talked to, he retired as a general, but Colonel Padilla since then about that moment. And we've walked through that, but just everything's different. Even how you process what's happening and process the loss of people you care about, it's all different than it is, in a normal kind of, here in the United States environment. So, yeah. And I think, honestly, that's one of the things that people struggle with when they come back from combat is you do all these things, but you push it down and move on, push it down and move on, push it down and move on. And you need to, because you're there to do a job. People get hurt if you're not focused on what you're doing. But at some point you have to process that. And a lot of people just never do or don't until much later. And that creates other issues. But, man, it's crazy. We ended up in Baghdad on April 10th. The Battle of Baghdad had over 100 casualties. Some KIA, most wounded in action. It was just this insane event. It took us like 12 hours to get to our objective. It was nuts. And I could walk all the way through it, but it's like you're living through a movie almost. It's just the craziest thing. And meanwhile, you're doing what you're trained to do. And a lot of it is muscle memory and response to the environment you're in. And then you get back and you're like, what just happened? That was crazy. But yeah, it's pretty weird.
Did you find at some point you just learn to cope with it and go on? Like when you're in that mode, right? Because, if you're just pushing day in and day out, do you get used to the violence, used to, the chaos, so that you can operate? Is that what's happening?
I have felt bad before. And I've thought about this a lot. Like, am I just, like there's something wrong with me or I'm just wired different or what is it that you can go through all of that and you feel, of course, because we all feel, but you kind of like, okay, well, that was terrible. Let's deal with whatever that is. Now let's just move on to the next thing and then the next thing. And it's almost Spartan living, because there was no base or anything. We were advancing. So wherever we were was the front line of the battle. This is the beginning of the war. And so it's like, okay, you get a meal, you drink water, you get your weapons ready, you're doing whatever you need to do to prepare for the next thing. You've got people out on watch, so you're doing what you're supposed to do. And there's like violence and chaos and brokenness and hurt, and then civilians that get hurt, and you're experiencing kind of like this weird view into the lives of the people who live there. I mean, going through farms and little towns and seeing people who are trying to go about their business, and you're just continuing to function. So yeah, and I've in reflecting on that, felt bad about it, but I think a lot of that is just like the training. You're here to do a job, and you have to disconnect yourself from a lot of the other realities so you can stay focused on what you're actually there to do. And that's how you stay alive and how you keep the people around you alive.
Yeah, honestly, it makes so much sense, right? Like you couldn't do both. You couldn't be in the midst of mourning and being so emotional, and at the same time protecting and fighting and doing all the things that you have to do in order to complete the mission. So yeah, it definitely makes a lot of sense. I guess at any point in the war, did you feel like your life was in danger or on the line? Or I haven't listened to, so like, I don't know if you got wounded or anything like that, but what was that like for you? Like, was there a moment where you felt like, wow, I might not make it out of this?
Yeah, I by God's grace did not get wounded. We were in a lot of firefights. The two times that was probably the most critical, or those times where you would, again, it's funny because when you're in the middle of it, you're fighting your way through it. So I don't remember having the thought we might not make it, but on the other side of the event, you look back and you go, yeah, I should not have made it through that. One was that Battle of Baghdad. It was crazy. So going into Baghdad, we took 1,200 Marines, again, middle of the night. We were supposed to get to our objective, which was a palace on the Tigris River. We got ambushed. Took us 12 hours to get there. 1,200 Marines, city the size of Los Angeles. Basically, we were ambushed with RPGs. So, thousands of RPGs, and we're returning fire again in a city. So that was a time where you look back and go, we probably shouldn't have made it through that, and some did not. But probably for me, and the story I tell the most often, my kind of mantra or brand is like way overused, right? But the name of my podcast is March or Die. The name of one of my books is called March or Die. And the story that's attached to that is about, the firefight that I should not have absolutely lived through. We moved toward a bridge in the middle of the day, and I could tell the whole story, but moved toward a bridge in the middle of the day. I was navigating for our battalion. I was the second vehicle back. Our battalion's 1,200 Marines, so it stretched over a couple of miles. We hit this objective where there was not supposed to be an enemy presence. We're ambushed with mortars. We hit a machine gun position. We fight through that. We get to the top of this bridge, and the bridge is what we were supposed to secure. So come up over this berm on top of this bridge. And when we get on the bridge, the mortars just continue to fall. And I'm standing outside of my vehicle, screaming into my radio handset, trying to get support from the battalion. We're having problems communicating because of the distance. Those mortar rounds keep falling. They're hitting, this kind of soft dirt around me. So they're exploding. The shrapnel's contained, but just the percussion and the smoke and everything that goes along with that. There's an anti-aircraft gun that the Iraqi soldiers are operating. They start swinging it our direction because now aircraft is not the problem. We're on top of their bridge. And that's the story that is kind of my March or Die story. And I have a sermon based on that, and I wrote a book and different things. But that was a moment that, by all rights, and again, I don't say this flippantly, only by God's grace did we make it out of that. We shouldn't have. In fact, there was no reason for us to. We should have died on top of the bridge. But fought
How did you get out of it?
Got to the other side. I mean, I had 8 vehicles up there that all had heavy machine guns on top of them, and then I had some tow vehicles, so tow missile launcher vehicles, and those machine guns started hitting the anti-aircraft gun. We pulled off that bridge, so we kept moving, got out of that kill zone, and then those tow missiles hit the mortar positions and stopped the fight. But we were, at one point, and this was my fault. It was just in the middle of the fight. It was a bad decision to get up there, but we had vehicles kind of bunched up on top of that bridge, which was a pre-planned target. So those mortars were falling like between my vehicles, between people standing there. Didn't hit a vehicle, didn't hit a person. And there's no good reason that it should have missed anyone. And so how did we get out of there? We fought, but ultimately, God kept us safe. And I say this, I tell that story. It was after that fight. So I was a Christian. I'd been raised in a Christian home. I was a Christian, but I had never really considered the sovereignty of God, or, that God is bigger than me, and, all of those things. And I remember standing on that dirt road when that fight was over, and just like being overwhelmed with God as sovereign, and the enemy doesn't care. Nobody cares. I do the best I can with what I have, but ultimately God is in control of what happens next. And that was that moment for me. But yeah, you talk about times you look back on and go, I shouldn't have made it. There were a few that were, iffy at best, but that one we absolutely shouldn't have. And God intervened, and I feel an obligation to tell the story. I mean, that's part of it. Yeah.
What an incredible story. It's so much responsibility, right? Like,
yeah,
going into battle is one thing. Having people relying on you to make good decisions is such a completely different thing. And how did you handle that responsibility?
I don't know that I handled it, better or worse than anyone else. I did the best I could and did what I thought was the right thing to do. I would say that looking back on my time as an infantry officer, even in Iraq, there are certainly decisions that I made or things that I did that I would say I regret, or I wish I hadn't done it that way. But I didn't do anything because, I was trying to be hurtful or spiteful or lazy or any of those things. I really believe that in those situations, even though I would change something now, I really was trying to make the best decisions I could at the time. And a big part of that is, when you're talking about leadership and leading others, is recognizing I am a leader here, but I'm not the leader here. There are other people who are also making decisions, people that I'm following, and my responsibility is to understand what higher wants me to do, and then to, align our plan at this level to that, and then to help the Marines that I'm responsible for get there. And so, there are a lot of layers to that as well. So it's not like I was alone, saying, hey, follow me. But you're making decisions in the moment, and you do the very best you can with the information that you have. And that's a life lesson too. You can't regret, or you shouldn't regret, doing the best you can with the information that you had at the moment. Don't live in that regret, And so,
it's an easy thing to do, right? Like, hindsight is an easy thing to drown in. I think for a lot of men, especially as you look back at your life and the mistakes that you made, and honestly, how your life could have been different, especially if you hurt other people, right? Like, if your poor choices cost somebody else. I've spent the last 20 years of my life counseling men and women, and helping people through. And a lot of people are stuck in regret, from their poor decisions. And, it is not an easy thing to be able to accept the fact that you're human, that you're not going to make a perfect decision every time. Right. And at some level, right, like, reconcile the fact that, well, that's why God has the ability to go back and make things new, and bring peace where there's chaos, and to forgive. And I think that's a massive lesson for every man, because otherwise, like, if you can't do that, then you spend the rest of your life as a man trying to not make mistakes, instead of trying to move forward and hit the target and accomplish stuff. Because I watch so many guys not want to risk, not want to, do things that could possibly make a mistake because of their past hurt. And then they end up living a life where they don't feel powerful, and they feel stuck. And so it's a big challenge and a massive responsibility, being so young, leading other people, having to, in the midst of chaos too, is just it's an impossible task.
Well, and I talk about that a lot from almost the other side, is I think back to that moment on the bridge and all of those things are happening. It could have been so overwhelming to me in that moment that I just, made the decision, conscious or otherwise, right? Made the decision. I'm going to stay here and whatever happens, happens, right? I don't want to make the wrong decision again. We probably shouldn't have gotten here, but here we are. I'm not going to make another decision. Well, the consequence of that would have been my death. But beyond me, it would have been the death of all of those Marines that were there with me. And so when we talk about, regret and certainly the paralysis of, I don't want to make the wrong decision, we have to come back to, it's not about you, right? So there are people that need for you to do something. Yeah. And if you do the best you can with the information that you have, even if it doesn't turn out the way that you thought it should or you'd like for it to, you are doing that for the benefit of those that you're leading. You're getting them off the X. You're taking them forward. You're helping them work through whatever they need to work through. It's not fundamentally about you. So you don't make decisions through that lens, nor should you look back and go, well, I wish I'd done better. Well, of course you do. We all do. But you do the best you can in the moment to carry those people forward, and then you make the next decision after that. But that regret, man, I talk about this when I'm talking about battles and how we move forward. But there are so many people that are overwhelmed by those unexpected events, and then they become lifelong victims of a one-time event. You become the lifelong victim of a one-time event. So now that your whole world, everything you see is through that lens. Everything you experience and feel is through that lens of that event that happened back there, instead of moving forward, as you mentioned, powerfully and with purpose. Huge issue that we have to address.
Yeah, that's so true, man. Because once you become a victim, you're the most powerless person, right?
Absolutely.
You give all your power away to this thing that happened. Man, that's huge. I guess I want to talk a little bit about your True Oaks Foundation. Before we dive totally into that, like, when did you start seeing that PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, was such a big thing, and what kind of gave you the heart to begin to go after that? I've worked with a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, I've worked with a decent amount of, military, and I worked with a guy who was a nurse in Iraq, and just all the stuff that he saw, right? Like afterwards, he didn't have the ability to process it, and it just completely transformed his life in a negative way because of all the PTSD that he was facing, and just the drugs and the alcohol and the pornography that he was consuming to cope with the crazy, stress and nightmares and all that stuff was wild. And when I was helping him, I mean, I don't know, 15 years ago, people weren't talking about it much, at least what I understood. Like I feel like PTSD is something that people have really started talking about in the last 10 years. And maybe you'd probably know better than I would, but that's what it really feels like.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. In fact, when I came home in 2003 and transitioned out of the Marine Corps immediately, we came home from Iraq. A month later, I was working on a church staff. Wow. I don't have a Bible degree. I didn't go to seminary, but my pastor, we're in a growing church, and he said, "Hey, we've got a lot going on here, and I'd love someone with leadership skills, organizational skills, help with some projects and different things." I'm like, "Yeah, I can do that, as long as I don't have to preach or teach or counsel." And probably within a month, I was preaching, teaching, and counseling. Yeah. So that's how church works. But and if you asked me, and people did in 2003 when I was coming out of the Marine Corps, going to work at the church, how do you feel about this post-traumatic stress thing? I would say, like, it's made up. It's not real. These are weak people. They've got other problems. It's not a real thing. And then I'm working on a church staff. And I became very frustrated, which led to anger. I would blame other people for every bad thing that happened in my life. I'm counseling couples. I'm 26 years old. I have no background in counseling. I'm trying to counsel military couples. Meanwhile, at home, I'm throwing things and hitting the wall and screaming at my kids. And my wife, by all rights, should have walked out on me and didn't. I am so disruptive in church staff meetings right? So staff meetings, I learned that how you operate in the infantry community is not how you're supposed to operate in the church staff office. And I'd get thrown out of church staff meetings. So I'm a complete disaster. The bottom's falling out of my life, and I'm saying, oh, that's post-traumatic stress thing. It's not real. And eventually, 11 months, I was on staff for 11 months there, and my pastor called me into his office. And to your point, no one was talking about it. He said, look, man, I don't know what's going on with you. I have no idea. I don't know how to help you. I love you and your family, but this is not working. You're so disruptive and causing so many problems. This is just not working, and you're going to have to figure out what you want to do.
Wow.
And there was kind of a process on the other side of that. And I ended up staying at that church for another 4 years. I was on staff there for 5 years, ended up pastoring a church actually in the Bay Area in Fremont, California for 7 years.
Wow.
But part of that process was, number one, taking responsibility for my actions. There are a lot of dumb people in the world, but not everyone's an idiot, right? So I got to stop.
Yeah.
So I got to stop, screaming at other people in the staff meetings. I've got to stop making fun of the worship pastor. Right? I've got to change my behavior because I'm the problem, not everyone else. I need to, repent to my wife and ask forgiveness and work through that. And so that began a process that God used in my life. And I always say it was a year-long process. My wife, she's like, no, it was a 10-year process. To the point that I was pastoring, and, this is a whole different conversation, but I was pastoring, and she would say, I would get so angry sometimes listening to you preach because what you were saying was true, but you weren't living it. And she would tell, we teach together sometimes on, in marriage conferences and that. And she'll say, there were times I just wanted to load the kids up and leave while you were pastoring, and I didn't do it because of how it would look. But, so there was a lot involved in that, right? And it was a long process of healing. And kind of in the middle of that, for me, I had to almost walk away from the Marine Corps. I was proud of my service. I was thankful for what I had done, but it was not healthy for me to keep looking back. And so I didn't even stay connected to anyone. This is 2003. Social media was not really around. And so it was easy to just disconnect, right? And so I did. And that was part of me moving forward. But then you fast forward 10 years, there is some social media. I'm on Facebook. Some of these guys started to find me. And so you just kind of reconnect loosely. And one of the guys that I served with reached out to me and said, hey, I met this guy. He's starting this thing called the Mighty Oaks Foundation. And it's for veterans. He's a Christian. I know you're a Christian. I'm not a Christian, but I thought you might like to meet this guy. And some of us are going out to this ranch in Colorado to spend some time with him and figure out what he's about. So I said, all right. And that was 10 years after I had left the Marine Corps. Ended up going out to Colorado. I met Chad Robichaux, who was founding, his family had just started the Mighty Oaks Foundation. And Chad's super motivated, professional mixed martial artist, had fought professionally, had done incredibly well, was a Marine, post-traumatic stress, left his family, almost killed himself. God got a hold of his life. So he's got all these weird kind of connection points. And then he said, God is the answer. I need to tell other veterans, right? And so I'm going to start Mighty Oaks Foundation. That's how Chad operates, and that's what he did. But we met, and he said, hey, I was pastoring at the time. I need help with curriculum and structure and all this other stuff. I know what I want to do. I just don't exactly know how to get it all together and figure it all out. And would you help me with that? Well, at that meeting, at that time in Colorado, there were about 10 guys that I had served with. And I was always so proud of bringing those, at the time I was 26, but they were like 18, 19 years old, bringing those kids home. I was always so proud of that. And then I started to hear stories. I'd been disconnected. I didn't know any of their stories post Marine Corps. Started to hear stories about suicide and started to hear stories about broken homes and marriages and people that were alive but barely living. And all these guys that I had served with, guys that had rotated back to Iraq and fought in Fallujah, and started to hear all of those stories. And so it really took me working through my stuff, and then some time and distance, and then understanding that my responsibility to those guys did not end when I put the uniform in the closet for the last time. I still had a responsibility to them. I didn't know much about post-traumatic stress then. I've since written on it and spent a lot of time thinking about it and talking about it. But what I did know was that as a Christian who believed that, the answers to brokenness are found in Christ, I had a responsibility to continue serving and ministering to those guys. And Chad asked me to come along and help, build the Mighty Oaks Foundation. And that's what we did. And we've been doing that since 2012.
Man, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah. What an incredible journey. Can we go back just a little bit to your story of like when your pastor called you out, which obviously, I mean, I've been in ministry since I was 24 and honestly grew up in church, on the pews, my whole life. So I know what it's like to be in ministry for a very long time. And I've definitely had times when my dad came in and said, "Hey, I would fire you if you weren't my son."
Yes.
And I said back to him, "I would fire myself. I want to fire me right now.
Yeah.
I don't want to be here anymore." Because it's so tough. It can be really tough, but that obviously was a really low moment. Like, how did you move forward? What was your approach? Did somebody come in and help you understand what you were dealing with? Or did you start to just make better decisions that eventually led you to figuring out, okay, I really do have PTSD. Did you start managing your behaviors better and then learn, okay, this is really what I'm dealing with. Here's how to manage it. What did you do?
Yeah. So at that time, I still wouldn't have said I had PTSD. In fact, I mean, I'm 47. I'm 20 years removed from the Marine Corps, and only recently have I even talked to anyone about, post-traumatic stress and my behaviors. What I knew then was that the way I was acting was absolutely destructive, and it was not only hurting, my family, but all of the other relationships that I cared about. So the church that I served in, that was the church my wife and I had been attending while I was in the Marine Corps. My wife and I were married when we were in college, and she became a Christian about a year after, a little more than that, a year and a half, maybe 2 years after we were married. And so, we went to that church together. We were, trying to figure out life. We had a baby. I say all of that to say that church cared for us when we were in the Marine Corps. So when I was asked to come on the church staff, that was a great transition for me. But when I was then later confronted by my pastor, it wasn't just, a guy or a pastor, right? This was a guy who loved us and cared for us, and I knew he did. And it was a confrontational conversation, but it was like one of those man, I wish I could help you. I just don't know how. And since I don't know how, you got to go. It was one of those kind of conversations, and I could feel his heart in it, and I cared for him and he cared for me. And so, it was just, okay, I need to start making better decisions. But in hindsight, what I should have done is then said, okay, I need help. I never got help. I didn't get help then. I have since then, but I didn't get help then. I just started to try to don't do that. Act better. Be responsible.
Manage the behavior.
Manage the behavior. And that's why it took 10 years. And that's why I was pastoring and still, a jerk to my family and still doing things I shouldn't have done, because I was never in a place then that I was willing to go hey, maybe I should talk to someone about this. I more just responded to oh, wow, I've been called out, so I need to fix this.
Which, wouldn't you say that, I mean, that's the average man, right? Is I'm not going to ask for help. I'm just going to try to do better, right? I'm going to suck it up. I'm going to, put my big boy pants on and try to do better. But gosh, man, I watch guys suffer under trying to do better for way longer than if they would just go, hey, listen, I got a problem. I need a little bit of expert advice. Could someone come in here and help me out a little bit? Honestly, I think that one of the biggest things that we can do for men is take away the stigma of somehow you're weak if you can't figure this out on your own.
Yeah, right. Yeah, being motivated to change, which I was, and that did reap some benefits. It kind of stopped the bleeding, right? But had I connected to a Christian counselor, a biblical counselor, or an older guy who had been through this before or whatever. Thankfully, I have a dad who pastored for over 30 years, who loves me, who would listen to me, and he helped me process a lot of things. My dad did. And I think that was maybe who I had, not maybe, that was who I had to help me work through that. But I really needed to get someone kind of outside of my family and outside of that kind of inner circle of my life who could have walked me through that. And that would have helped me, help my family, help my kids. I have 4 kids. My oldest 2 are 24 and 22. And then I have 2 teenage kids. There's 7 years between my oldest 2 and my youngest 2. And it's almost like they've had 2 different fathers because I was so different. My behavior was so different when raising the older ones versus the younger ones. And they let me know that for sure, which is, a lot of fun. But getting help. Don't be afraid to find somebody. If you don't want to go to a counselor, that's fine. Find an older Christian guy who's got some life experience who can walk you through that. And that's so helpful.
Well, I always say this, like, I was on the Aaron Snyder podcast, this last year, and we were talking, he brought me on to talk about, manhood and getting help and masculinity. And I was saying to him, like, man, who's the tougher guy, right? Like, who's the stronger guy? The guy that can reach out and actually say, I need help, or the guy who never actually does it? And again, like, we really do have this stigma. And I honestly, I have to fight against it. And this is what I do for a living. Like, I have to fight against the feeling of like not wanting to, it's not even just feel weak. It's like, I feel incompetent or I feel embarrassed. And I have to go back to like, hey, listen, man, you could add the strength of somebody else who really loves you and who really wants to help you. And you can get yourself out of a hole so much quicker if you would just use your courage, right? To make a good decision, to reach out and get help. I'm curious too, because I think this is a really common story for men where they're a jackass for a long time and their wife sucks it up and takes it. Like, how did you repair that with your wife and build back trust with her?
Yeah, my wife is, I always say that she's the best leader that I know, and she really is. She's a better leader than I am. Wow. And she would tell you that she came to the point in her life where she just said, I'm done just taking it. I'm done just accepting it. And that was maybe a turning point in our marriage where, instead of going along with my my temper tantrums and, my bad behavior and just being rude and obnoxious and all those things, instead of just going along with that, she started to push back on it. And that definitely kind of sped up that process. It wasn't fun, but it sped up a process of us needing to work through it. And it just takes time. I'll tell you, this is a conversation I have often with men. You can't spend years breaking trust and expect for it to be rebuilt in a weekend. That's what a lot of guys that come to our program, it's like, man, I've cheated on my wife 4 times and I look at pornography 3 times a day. And when I go home, I'm going to apologize and she needs to accept that. And then, a week later, it's like, why doesn't she trust me? I told her. Because for 15 years, you've been doing the wrong thing. Right. And so a lot of it, honestly, was her deciding that she was going to continue to love me and care for me. And because God said, not because I deserved it, but because God said, and understanding that her responsibility was to God first. And so a lot of it for us was, she's a strong Christian. She honors God, understands what the Bible says, and is going to live according to that. So that's a big part of it. And then for me, it's just been, not doing it, apologizing, trying to get back, not doing it, apologizing, getting back. And then, you hope that the average becomes more positive and more leadership and more doing the right thing. And over time that's happened. So it's just a long process, and it's a relationship. It requires both people to be involved in it.
I really love and respect that your wife did that, because I try to help. I mean, I work with a lot of women and wives whose husbands are, out of control in one way or another. And I'm constantly trying to help them set boundaries, draw healthy boundaries, right? And have needs. And because a lot of times it's what it takes for radical change to happen is for one or the other person to go like, hey, listen, I'm not going to live like this anymore.
That's right. That's right.
And
that's right.
It's so hard because you don't want to lose somebody that you really love, and you don't want to disrupt the home, and you don't want your kids to grow up with either without a dad or without a mom, or you don't want a divorce. But if you just enable that behavior, then that becomes the environment that the kids grow up in. It becomes the environment of your marriage, and nothing ever changes. And so what a freaking radical step for your wife to go like, hey, listen, I love you, but this isn't how marriage is supposed to be. And to draw that line, like, what a gift that she gave you.
Yeah. I mean, and again, I've said this many, many times. I'll continue to say it. The reason we're still married today is because of her. And, she has, innate God-given abilities and qualities that make her an incredible leader. She runs the women's program for Mighty Oaks, and it's a huge program with a lot going on. And she's a strong counselor, and she's very principled. And so all of those things certainly contributed to that. But it was, her literally coming to the point where she said, look, you're not going to yell at the kids anymore. That's not going to be okay. You're not going to treat me that way anymore. That's not okay. And it was setting boundaries, but beyond that, even really, it was calling me out on it. Like, this is not just going to pass as acceptable behavior anymore. And so if you want to behave that way, you can, but we're not going to be okay with it. And, sincerely, I love my family, but I needed to be called out on that.
It's powerful. I was talking to some guys recently, and I was just telling them, like, man, when you break your own promises, you don't respect you, and we all want other people to respect us, right? Like, everyone wants somebody to respect them, and we're all trying to dress up like that and talk a big game. But the truth is like, when you do things that you don't respect and then expect somebody to respect you in a way that you don't respect you, it's impossible, right? And so we have to live according to the standard that we want to respect ourselves to. And so, like, man, it really is true. I tell guys all the time, I lead guys in discipleship, like, man, you got to quit breaking your promises to yourself. You can't go yell at your kids and yell at your wife and not show up at home and check out and then feel confident about who you are. It doesn't work. You got to flip that around, right? Like, you got to show up at home and be present and manage your appetite and manage your emotions in a way that is noble, in a way that makes you feel proud of yourself. And it is such a journey for us, right? Like, no one does it perfect. And especially, coming out of the military and really working through the trauma. And I worked through a lot of trauma in my life, a lot. And I didn't go to the military, but growing up in my home, I dealt with a lot of trauma from my past. And it's part of what led to a nervous breakdown in 2009 with me. And man, it's hard. If you've never gone through a nervous breakdown or anxiety or dealt with it for a long time, you feel like, gosh, why didn't he just suck it up? Why didn't he just do better?
Right. Yeah.
But it's hard. It's not easy. And really reaching out to get help and to move forward, to me, is like, it's such a big key. We don't have that much time left. I want to just talk a little bit about the Mighty Oaks Foundation and what you do. I think we have 5 minutes left on our recording card. But I want to talk about Mighty Oaks Foundation, what you do, and how guys can get connected, like who should get connected and then how to get connected if they need to. Yeah.
So the Mighty Oaks Foundation, the best way to get connected, I'll start with that, I guess, is go to our website, mightyoaksprograms.org, mightyoaksprograms.org. And there is a place to apply, a lot of information, resources, videos, tons of stuff for those who may be dealing with trauma, some of these struggles that we've even talked about today, or family members who have those people in their lives and they're looking for resources. So that's a good place to start. We serve primarily veterans, active duty service members, first responders, And then spouses, we work with spouses as well because we understand, so much of this trauma is brought home and then dumped on the person that we say we love, right? And so we work with spouses as well. And we do that in a number of ways. The core kind of program that we have is what we call the Legacy Program. We have 5 facilities across the country, and we bring either men or women. So we have a separate men's and women's program. We bring those men or women to one of those facilities. We talk about trauma. We talk about what it is and what it does and what it looks like. But really, that's kind of the smallest part of what we do. Beyond that, we talk about how God, the creator, that's our starting point. God is the creator. And if he is the creator, then he gave us purpose and hope and meaning. And if we'll learn how to align our lives to the lives God created us to live, that trauma, that stuff in our past, we need to deal with it. It doesn't go away. But when we're moving toward the person God created us to be in relationship with him through Christ, then that stuff no longer has a hold on us. It's still there. Again, it's still, part of our experience and often part of who we are, but we can move forward in spite of that. We're not chained to that anymore because of who God is, what he's done for us, and what he continues to do for us, that there is hope, not because of, something we can do on our own, but because of who God is. And we talk about that for a week. And then beyond that, after the program, we'll work to get folks to counselors and churches and whatever other resources they need. But that's the starting point for us, is understanding, regardless of what you've done, where you've been, what's happened to you, what you've done to others, God has a plan for your life. And thankfully, we have about 1,000 folks a year come through one of those programs. Wow. And because of donors, we're able to pay for the program and pay for travel to get to the program. So literally the output for a person to attend is 5 days. They just need to set aside 5 days and we take care of everything else. Maybe it's trauma related to your military service or your service as a first responder or the service of your spouse. Maybe it's something that happened to you in your childhood, which is often the case. Whatever it is, whatever you may be struggling with, big or small, don't disqualify yourself. If you're a veteran, active duty service member, first responder, or spouse, go ahead and fill out an application and let us help you get to a program.
Man, honestly, I love what you're doing. I think you would know the statistic better. You just did this big run, but you just did a run. You did what, 22 for 22? Is that what it was called?
Yeah. Yep,
and just bringing awareness that 22 veterans commit suicide every single day, and people don't understand the effects of trauma. We started out with that, but I love your heart, man. I love you taking on, just this giant in removing the stigma around getting help, bringing hope to men's life, being an example, a man that other men can look at and model their life after. Honestly, with the world that we live in today, like, we need men like you who, no matter what you've been through in your life, you can look to a guy like Jeremy and go, okay, it's possible, right? Like, if he can do it, I can do it. And, if he can rebuild his marriage, I can rebuild my marriage. If he can, live and work through and make peace with the regrets in his life, like, I can do the same thing. And dude, you're just such an inspiration. And I really, really appreciate you coming on here today and just sharing some of your time, but also giving men a resource. Thank you so much, man. It means a lot.
Well, I appreciate it, Jason. I appreciate all the work you guys are doing too. So thank you. And hopefully we'll do this again. Maybe we'll do it on my podcast.
Yeah, it sounds great, man. All right, BraveCo men, have an incredible week. I want to urge you guys to go over there. If you're a military, first responder, firefighter, and you're struggling, please go there and get some help. Otherwise, have an incredible week. Hey guys, thanks so much for listening to the BraveCo podcast. If you like this podcast, would you please rate it, review it, leave us a great comment. And if you like this episode in particular, share it with your friends and family. That helps us to spread the word. Guys, stay brave. We'll see you next week.